Hi, Steve.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Not bad.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show on Blogging Hits TV. You are Stephen Walt, a professor, I guess, in the political science department at Harvard. Anyway, you're a scholar of international relations, right? Or you're at the Kennedy School
That's correct.
at Harvard? Okay, so that's your affiliation. You're probably best known as author of The Israel Lobby, which you co-authored with John Mearsheimer. And I want to talk a little about the Israel lobby in the context of this Iran nuclear deal. And then I want to also talk about the general mess in the Middle East, things like ISIS, Turkey, and so on. Now, for starters, I know you define the Israel lobby in the book as going beyond, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is literally a lobby which sees its mission as lobbying for the interests of Israel as defined by the Israeli government. Basically, nobody denies that that's, in a sense, an Israel lobby. You define it more broadly, and I want to get to that. But before we do, with this Israel deal, I'm not aware of a time when AIPAC's role in lobbying has ever been quite this prominent. I don't know how far back you'd have to go. I don't quite remember the issue of selling these planes to the Saudis in the 80s, which was kind of an issue. But is this about as public as things have gotten?
I think it probably is. I mean, the obvious analog would be the 82 AWAC sale to Saudi Arabia, where AIPAC was quite visibly opposed to the deal, and a number of other groups as well were weighing in. And there was a real fight, between the Reagan administration and at least, a number of people who are, consider themselves pro-Israel. That's, I think, the one other place where you can really see a quite visible public fight for essentially votes in the Senate, because that deal had to be approved as well. I think the one thing that has changed, and I may have had a role to play in this along with a number of others, is in the fight over the Iran deal, the whole discourse about the role of groups like AIPAC and their various cousins or interrelated organizations has just become more public. More people willing to talk about it, more journalists, looking carefully at who these different organizations are. So in that sense, I think we have a slightly more open discussion. And when you see such prominent high-level activity going on a sort of daily basis, being reported in the New York Times, being reported in the Wall Street Journal, being reported in lots of other places, it's really put the spotlight on the lobby and all of these organizations in a way that hasn't been true before. Add to that, then, the very visible role that some people like Sheldon Adelson and other wealthy people who have been trying to influence American politics in a variety of ways, the greater public attention about the role of money in our politics, etc. And again, it just intensifies that gaze, brightens the spotlight, and gives us a lot to talk about.
Yeah. And whatever role you may have played in this kind of, broadening of the discussion, I think you would agree that you have to share some credit with Bibi Netanyahu, right? I mean, has there ever been an Israeli prime minister who so publicly and vociferously opposed and lobbied against a U.S. policy that was considered so important by a U.S. president?
No, I think that he's really, set the curve in that regard. I do think it does reflect, though, a shift in Israeli politics over time. If you go back 20 or 30 years, it really was, I think, an article of faith within Israeli politics that maintaining a good relationship with the American president was a top priority. People sometimes forget that Yitzhak Shamir lost the prime ministership to Rabin back in the early 90s, in part because he was perceived by Israelis as having a not very good relationship with the first Bush administration, the elder President Bush, and that this was bad for Israel to be sort of out of step with the American president, even though there were some policy differences between Israel and the United States at that point. I think that's changed to some degree. One of the things we've seen since Obama was elected is that these public fights between Obama and Netanyahu have actually helped Netanyahu's popularity
Right.
within Israel, something that would not have happened, I think, 20 or 30 years ago. So even though I think it's been corrosive to the U.S.-Israeli relationship, it's helped his political fortunes. And like most Democratic politicians, the first priority is often to retain your popularity at home.
Yeah. Now, you, as I said, you define the Israel lobby in the book more broadly than just AIPAC. Did you read this piece by John Judas in Slate about the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is a think tank? I don't know how much, did you talk about them in the book? But I mean, briefly, I should say the piece was about this being probably the think tank, the most influential think tank, pretty much devoted to work against the Iran deal, and is that, I assume this think tank has been on your radar screen for some time.
Right. It's been around for a while, and it would be considered part of what we call the Israel lobby. You know, we talked about this at some length in the book. I mean, the term lobby is sort of common parlance. We talk about the gun lobby. We talk about, healthcare lobbies, things like that. What we're really talking about, of course, is interest groups. And interest groups have, in almost all cases, regardless of the realm, a number of different components to them. So we define the Israel lobby as a loose coalition of groups whose uniting feature is that they're all working within the American political system to sustain a special relationship between the United States and Israel. And that special relationship is one where the United States gives Israel essentially unconditional support, doesn't cross it, doesn't put real pressure on it in various ways. Some of those groups, like AIPAC, are formal lobbying organizations, and says right up front on their website, we are America's pro-Israel lobby. Other groups like FDD and other think tanks, I would put YNEP in there, are research organizations with
for Near East policy.
Right. Our research and advocacy organizations with a very decidedly pro-Israel slant to them. They're clearly part of trying to sustain an attitude of support for Israel, but they're not necessarily engaged in formal lobbying activities. But similarly, if you took, like, say, the arms control movement in the United States, you wouldn't say the arms control movement is just the Arms Control Association. Right. It has a number of different components, and you might even put in it, academics who write on arms control related topics, but always have a particular point of view, always have a particular advocacy. So I think, as with most other interest groups, there's many different components to it. And the Israel lobby is a broad coalition that doesn't agree on every single issue. Not every single group or every single individual agrees on every particular issue, but they all agree on trying to support the special relationship. And you don't find them, say, ever arguing that the United States should cut its economic or military support for Israel or vote against Israel in the UN Security Council as a means of advancing broader American foreign policy objectives. I think if you saw a group do that, I would say it's probably not part of the Israel lobby.
Okay. And I guess kind of the core of, what you would call the lobby, these think tanks have to figure centrally, right? When you look at the way this whole debate has worked, AIPAC puts pressure on people in Congress, and AIPAC has access to a whole network of funders beyond the money that AIPAC itself has. And so in various ways it can exert leverage, but that's, as John Judas said in the piece, that's not really enough. You need intellectual and rhetorical firepower. You need talking points, arguments you can point to, experts you can say back you up. And that's where I guess FDD has been really very important. This is the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
That's right. And that's not all that dissimilar from, again, the role that YNEP has played, the role that the Sabin Center within Brookings, I think, played a number of times. Certainly the American Enterprise Institute, the foreign policy group there, has been very staunchly pro-Israel, very much neoconservative in orientation as well. And so, all of these groups, and there's a lot of overlap between the people who work at different organizations, move from one to another at different times. They're all part of trying to sustain an intellectual climate that tends to mirror the interests of the Israeli government and also tends to, again, defend the special relationship under any and all circumstances.
Sounds like you're in demand. I mean, maybe among telemarketers for all we know, but among somebody.
Right.
So yeah, although it shifts over time. So like, I think AEI has not been as involved in the Iran issue as, say, they were in the run-up to the Iraq War. And we should say the run-up to the Iraq War was a slightly different thing. AIPAC didn't take a position on the Iraq War and so on. So that was not, that's
actually not entirely true. AIPAC did not take a public position about it. They were certainly not as out front on the Iraq War as they have been in opposing the Iran deal. But there's abundant evidence that AIPAC was quietly lobbying Congress in a variety of ways. A number of congressional staffers have reported this. The then president of AIPAC, Howard Corr, actually said in, I think, 2002 or 2003 that one of his great accomplishments was to quietly lobby in favor of it. So they didn't take the lead, but they were certainly supportive.
But in any event, I mean, AEI has, I think, been less involved in the Iran thing than they were in the run-up to the Iraq War. The Saban Center at Brookings that you mentioned, has that kind of disappeared? I think they lost their money from, this guy, I guess he's Israeli or Israeli-American or something, Haim Saban, or I'm not sure about his name. He's a big Hillary Clinton supporter.
Right.
She has been kind of initially ambivalent about the Iran deal, perhaps relatedly. He's not enthusiastic about it, but in any event, so Brookings, and in fact, one of their most, what's his name, Michael Doran, he left, is that his name? Doran, D-O?
Yes.
So he left Brookings, I think went to some more avowedly right-wing think tanks. There's been like a shift at Brookings, and so the thing is kind of fluid, right? I mean, and in general, I would say in general about the whole think tank situation at Washington, not just on this issue, but in general, I think of think tanks as things that convert what Marxists call, infrastructure into superstructure, or what, you know what I mean? It's like Marx had this idea that ultimately the ideas floating around in society and religion and culture and so on reflect the underlying power dynamics and economic dynamics. And I've become more and more convinced that that's true, not just on this issue, but on lots of issues. And what think tanks are the things that help make that happen, right? Is that too crazy? I mean, you're probably not a Marxist, but you see what I'm saying, right?
No, I think the Marxist term was superstructure.
Oh, okay, sorry,
right?
Yeah. What did I say? So it's infrastructure and wait, what?
Well, the material, we're going to rapidly devolve into a political theory seminar here, but, Marxist was basically the material forces of production, and then there's the ideological superstructure on top of that justifies them, that fools the masses, gives them false consciousness, et cetera, et cetera. I'd say a couple of different things about this. I mean, you're absolutely right that part of what makes any interest group work is not just having resources that can be brought to bear to reward politicians or punish politicians through campaign contributions and things like that. So that's one part of this whole thing. The second thing is you want to have people developing ideas and purveying sets of arguments to support particular policies. This was, I think, the reason that YNIP, the Washington Institute, was created, with people like Martin Indyk, who was working for AIPAC at the time, understood that in addition to having lots of people who could go up on the Hill, you wanted to also have people who could write books, articles, op-eds, pages, provide research that supported different points of view and was also perceived as being independent, or at least somewhat more independent. So when a researcher from AIPAC shows up, you kind of knew in advance what their position was likely to be. Independent scholar working, YNIP would at least have the appearance of being more objective, even though, in fact, on many issues, they're not likely to deviate from the central line. Second point I think is really important to emphasize here is something you just said. These are sort of fluid operations. and there are going to be differences over time, and individuals' views are going to change over time. To take Martin Indyk as a perfectly good example, I think his views on Middle East politics, on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, etc., have evolved a lot over the last 20 or 25 years.
He's like a moderate on today's spectrum. Yeah,
I think that's right, and I think that not just that the world has moved. I think his thinking has become more sophisticated on many of these questions. And again, that just conveys that this is not some kind of secretive cabal. This is not some sort of conspiracy theory taking over the U.S. government. This is an interest group, and it's politics as it's done in the United States. And those interest groups are going to evolve over time. They're going to shift positions in certain ways. I think AIPAC itself has evolved in some ways, moved actually to the right over the last 20 or 30 years from what was originally a kind of centrist, pro-Israel operation.
Well, the Israeli government has moved to the right? And AIPAC's mission is to serve, advance the policies of the Israeli government. So that makes sense.
I also think if you look at the donor base for AIPAC, it's moved more towards the GOP. And one of the things we've seen with the Israel lobby, although it's worked very hard over the years to be bipartisan and retain support in both parties, we've seen with the split between Netanyahu and Obama and some shifts within, I think, both the Democratic and Republican Party, that now the really ardent, pro-Israel people in the United States tend to be very strongly associated with the GOP, or at least more of them are in the GOP. And there are people within Israel and also within the lobby itself that are worried about this because they don't want Israel to be a partisan issue. They want it to be a bipartisan issue of constant and unconditional support.
And that brings us to kind of the consequences of this very public fight. Now, I kind of, I guess the smart money now would say probably the deal is going to go through, that Obama's going to get enough support to sustain a veto of a bill against the deal. But I think the jury's out. We don't know for sure. In any event, I kind of wonder if, quote, winning on this issue would be worse for AIPAC and maybe for Israel than losing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, give me your view.
First of all, this would be seen as a very powerful demonstration of its power. It's a little tricky when you're trying to measure the impact of any lobby. You don't just look at sort of wins and losses. You have to ask yourself what the policy would be if the lobby didn't exist. So if AIPAC loses on this one, and I think you're right, the smart money suggests they probably will, that doesn't mean it has no clout. That doesn't mean it has, influence at all. In some cases, you can lose and sort of win in the long run. AIPAC lost the AWACS fight back in '82 against the Reagan administration, but it was such a big fight. Reagan basically never took them on again. We're never going to go through that one. And so even now, if they were to lose on the Iran deal, future American politicians will still be asking themselves, do we really want to tackle them on this particular issue? And on lots of other issues like the aid package, I think the peace process, it's still going to remain very influential. So if they were to win on this one, however, then you have to ask sort of what the consequences are going forward. This would be seen as a diplomatic humiliation for the United States. We went to enormous lengths to broker this deal. We had lots of international support. All of our major European allies are behind it. Russia and China are behind it. The world in general is behind it. Sort of the only government that's come out against it is the government of Israel. And for the United States to be essentially thwarted by a domestic interest group at this point, I think would be very of great concern, very obvious to many Americans. Second, there's the point that President Obama has made. If you don't get the deal, then Iran is unconstrained in its pursuit of a nuclear capability. And what are the other options that are left? And if we find ourselves facing the only way to prevent them from, at some point down the road, crossing the nuclear threshold is military action, it's going to be very hard for groups like AIPAC to say, oh, well, we had nothing to do with creating a situation where now we have to contemplate the use of military force. Right? AIPAC and most other groups never want to be blamed for moving the United States closer to war. But it's going to be hard for them to avoid that accusation because, in fact, they foreclosed the diplomatic option.
Right. And I would think if they, win on the issue, also, I mean, I would think there's going to be a very public discussion about the degree of influence and whether that's in the interests of the U.S. And I don't think, I don't really think they want to, I don't really think they want to have that argument in the wake of a big thing like this, where a lot of people would see America's interests as having not been served by the outcome.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in a funny way, from a purely sort of domestic politics, who has clout, influence, etc., the optimal outcome for AIPAC would be to put up a good fight, right? Lose,
right?
Donors will be happy that at least they put up a good fight. Future politicians will always take them into account, because you have to ask, how many big wrestling matches do you want to have with powerful lobbies? And yet the deal does, in fact, go through. Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons. We don't have a war with Iran. And yet they can still retain enormous influence in Washington.
Yeah. I mean, I almost wonder if their heart is really in this thing. I mean, they are obliged by their mission to pursue it because Bibi's policy is to oppose this, right? I mean, they don't really, if their mission is what they say it is, they kind of have to at least make a show of opposing it. And I got to say, look, they're spending a ton of money on advertising and you can see that on CNN, and they are putting a lot of effort into it. But I've got to wonder if there aren't people at AIPAC who are kind of wouldn't mind if they didn't win. But who knows?
Well, I do think there's one other issue here, and we should touch on it briefly. I have thought all along that the nuclear dimension to this is actually secondary. First of all, there's no real evidence that Iran is dead set on getting nuclear weapons at all. I think they would like the latent capacity to pursue a nuclear weapon if at some point down the road they think they need one, but there's no evidence that they're hell-bent to acquire one, and therefore I'm actually quite confident they're not going to cheat on the deal in any significant way, etc. I think the real issue, and it's the one that I think ultimately troubles Netanyahu and ultimately troubles AIPAC or the people in the lobby who are opposed to this, is the idea of Iran getting out of the penalty box in the Middle East and sort of rejoining the international community, restoring not a close relationship with the United States, but a workable relationship with the United States. And I think that troubles not just Israel, but other countries in the region, because Iran has a lot of power potential. It's going to be an influential actor. There are some obvious disagreements or differences with other states in the region. And for groups like AIPAC, if the United States starts to do business with Iran, again, not become an ally, not become close, that increases our flexibility in the region, gives us more options, and that means it gives us a bit more leverage when we're dealing with our other friends in the region. If you're an Israeli or a Saudi and you know that the Americans aren't just talking to you, but they're also talking to Tehran, you have to think more about keeping the Americans happy, things you can do to make the Americans want to lean to your side as opposed to taking the Iranian side. Now, from a selfish American perspective, I like the idea of the United States having flexibility, and I like the idea of us having leverage over our friends and our adversaries. If I were an Israeli, I don't want the United States talking to Tehran. I want the only countries we really talk to in the Middle East to be Israel and maybe countries that Israel has a tacit working relationship with.
Although I think the fear that drives some of the opposition to this scenario in Israel, and it came through in John Judas's Slate piece, that at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, if you look closely at the concerns of some of these people, it looks like maybe the big fear is actually a rapprochement between Iran and the U.S. down the road. And I think there's a big fear of that in Israel. The reason I think the fear is overblown, I mean, it really gets back to your specialty here, is I think to think that the U.S., in the extreme form of the scenario, where the U.S. buddies up with an Iran that is hell-bent on like regime change in Israel and having Hezbollah fire rockets into Israel and so on, to think that rapprochement with the U.S. could survive an extremely hostile Iranian policy toward Israel down the road, it seems to me to misunderstand American domestic politics, right? I mean, I don't think that could happen.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I don't think this is likely to happen quickly. I think what one can imagine, however, is that in the short term, the United States maybe doesn't even restore full diplomatic relations, but it does have more frequent consultations with Iran on issues where our interests are parallel. That would include, say, dealing with the Islamic State in Iraq, trying to manage what's going on in Iraq, possibly Iranian assistance in working out some kind of deal on Afghanistan that ends our involvement there, ends the war there, where Iran has been helpful in the past and is actually rather skeptical or opposed to the Taliban as well. So there are some areas where we could actually work with Iran even today. I think then the possibility is whether or not Iran's policies towards Israel, towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, towards Hezbollah, et cetera, if those start to modify over time, then you can imagine the door sort of opening for a more extensive, I don't want to even use the word partnership, but a more sort of collaborative or business-like relationship on other issues. We don't know if that's going to happen, but I think this deal at least opens the door to that possibility. And any movement in that direction does, I think, improve the overall American position to deal with others in the region.
Right. So I think it's implied by that a deal could actually down the road incentivize Iran to moderate its policies toward Israel. And you don't know, but that's one scenario, right?
Right.
You agree? Okay. Speaking of things like ISIS, you were quoted in a New York Times piece that trotted out the prospect that ISIS could evolve into a, quote, normal state. And it was implied that maybe some of the fears of ISIS are overblown because that's kind of a plausible scenario that is horrific as a lot of things they do are, and as horrific as probably some of their domestic policies and human rights policies would be for some time to come. I think the argument was that for practical purposes, in terms of like the external world dealing with ISIS, it could become a more normal political actor. Is that the idea?
Yes, but with many caveats. I mean, let me sort of lay out what I was saying to the Times, and I've been writing some things this. Pardon me?
I said you broke up a little there, but what you were saying was yes, but with many asterisks or caveats or something. So
yeah.
So go ahead.
So first point I'd make is that we should think about ISIS or the Islamic State as a revolutionary state. It's not like Al-Qaeda. They're actually trying to build all of the features of a territorial state within the area they control. They collect taxes, they administer justice, they run an educational system, they have a propaganda arm. They have a lot of the features now that we think of as being part of a territorial state, and they have shown a certain degree of staying power. So we have to at least think about the possibility that they're not going to collapse quickly, that Baghdad is not going to reimpose its authority over these areas, and that 2 years from now, they're still going to be in control in more or less the area that they're in. They're not a normal state by any means. First of all, their internal policies have many features that we don't associate with normal states, although they are not unique to the Islamic State. And second, their avowed purpose is revolutionary. They claim their goal is to spread their model beyond the area they now control, overturn other Arab and Islamic governments, and eventually overturn other governments elsewhere. I think this is a crazy set of objectives that they will never realize, but that's what they claim they want to do. That's not very different than what the French revolutionaries said they were going to do back in 1792. Go read about the Jacobins, who, by the way, were fond of beheading people as well. That's what the Bolsheviks claimed they were going to do in 1917. They were going to spread communism all over the world, and eventually they were able to do so, in part because they were a major power. So ISIS should be thought of as, a little bit like them, or perhaps even better, like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, who also had a sort of wild ideology and did a lot of pretty horrific things. I think that, therefore, if you think about them in this context, it doesn't mean we start doing business with them tomorrow or anytime soon, but we have to at least consider how we're going to deal with them if they're still around in a couple of years or 5 years, and if they begin to then moderate those extreme objectives and want to sort of start cutting deals with others. The United States eventually recognized the revolutionary Soviet Union 17 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, and I don't rule out the possibility that if the Islamic State evolved and abandoned many of its current objectives, certainly in practice, we would eventually start looking for whether we'd at least start asking ourselves the question of how we were going to deal with them. Just one final point. I think the other piece of good news in all of this is revolutionary states like the Islamic State are only a real problem when they occur in a major power like Russia in 1917, France in the 1790s. And fortunately, the Islamic State is quite weak. I think its message resonates to some degree in other parts of the world, but it's not likely to expand either by conquest or by contagion to lots of other countries. So this is a problem, but it's not an existential threat.
So you don't think a country like Saudi Arabia is vulnerable to destabilization? I mean, that regime seems to me, to be in some ways a little fragile or lacking in kind of deep-rooted legitimacy or something. You don't think they have anything to fear?
I think it's something they should worry about, because you're going to see some resonance inside Saudi Arabia. There are going to be some people who are, I think a very small number of people, but some people who are attracted to this message, who will, be inspired by it, will maybe conduct acts of violence as well. But I think we often underestimate the resilience of the Saudi state. People have predicted it was going to have massive problems for a long time. They have a lot of money. They have extensive security forces. They have lots of social welfare programs that they can use to alleviate discontent. If I were the Saudis, I would be taking this seriously, and I would be taking steps to ensure that the message didn't find a ready audience there. But if I had to bet, I would say Saudi Arabia will not, face a serious challenge, especially once people learn more and more about what, sort of life in ISIS land is like. And there, I think it doesn't look particularly appealing the more you get to know it.
No, although some people find it appealing. And I mean, that's kind of one question I have is, suppose it becomes a more, quote, normal state. I mean, if there's a continued influx into it of the people who seem drawn to it now, it could acquire pretty distinctive demographics, like a whole lot of young males who like violence, for example. It would now of course in the territory, a certain amount of territory that ISIS occupies, you have a lot of people who were just there. They were just the Sunnis living in these towns. ISIS took over, but to the extent that over time there's a large, imported population of people who are drawn to the ideology, that could be a pretty distinctive kind of state, right?
Yeah, although it's also, if you think about it, first of all, this same phenomenon happens after every revolution I've ever studied. People flocked to Moscow after the Bolshevik Revolution because they wanted to help build the socialist utopia. Some of those people, like John Reed,
that was a different kind of motivation. But okay.
Well, I'm not so sure. It's the idea that they're going to do some wonderful thing, create this pure Islamic state that really is true to their particular version of Islam, etc., and people get seduced by this. I think it also appeals very much to a sentiment in parts of the Islamic community about how the West and the United States have been beating up on the Arab and Islamic world for a long time, and this is an opportunity to sort of stand that this group is defending Islam in a more staunch and resolute way than anybody else is, and that is appealing in certain respects as well. It's possible you could get, this sort of a hothouse of real hotheads there, but that's not likely to be, well, there's 2 points to make. One is it might be better to confine all of those people in one particular spot, particularly a spot that's mostly empty desert. It doesn't have a lot of natural resources, it doesn't really have a lot of oil, etc. But secondly, these are movements also that are incredibly prone to schisms and quarrels and disagreements. Even if an ISIS or an Islamic State clone were to gain power someplace else, and my favorite candidate right now would be Libya, right? Almost ungoverned space now with no real authority. It's conceivable that a bunch of people who claim to have some affinity or allegiance to the Islamic State gain power there. They're going to have their own interests. They're going to have their own objectives. They're not going to sit and wait for orders from the Islamic State, from al-Baghdadi, right? And in fact, given that the ideology is one that is very quick to denounce people as heretics if they disagree in the slightest way, I think even if this movement were to gain some momentum, what you're going to get is not some big revolutionary monolith. What you're going to get is a deeply fratricidal, quarreling family where the disagreements are really quite intense.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the
and maybe even more intense than their disagreements with us. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, Bob.
Oh, I was just saying, on the first point you made about, well, maybe there's some virtue in concentrating all the hotheads in one place. I have kind of wondered about the U.S. policy of trying to intercept every American who wants to go there. I mean, my thinking is I'd kind of rather have them there than in my shopping mall. But anyway, on the larger question of ISIS, so what would your policy be if you were in charge of U.S. foreign policy? What would your policy toward ISIS be?
I think the objective here is essentially patient containment. We don't want it to expand territorially. I think it's unlikely that it will because it's not actually very powerful militarily. And anytime it starts hitting non-Sunni groups, whether it's the Kurds or the Turks or the Shia, it has real trouble. So it's not going to be all that difficult to keep it from expanding militarily, conquering others. Secondly, we want to encourage its neighboring states to insulate themselves in various ways against the possibility of contagion. We can't do that particularly well. The U.S. government is not going to put out persuasive and credible messages on what the true interpretation of Islam ought to be and how they are, in fact, deviations, etc. We're just not going to be the best source of that. But people in Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and elsewhere can, and we should be encouraging them to do that. Most importantly, though, the American role in all of this has to be very much in the background, right? If the United States does what it normally does, which is to insist on taking the lead and doing all the heavy lifting, and we're in charge here and we're going to claim all the credit, this plays into their narrative that we are the bad guys. We're just out to destroy Islam. It makes them look more important, right? You've got the world's most powerful country focusing all of its attention on a relatively modest group of not very powerful or capable people. This is a boon to their propaganda because they can then go and talk about all the wonderful things they're doing against those horrible Americans. And finally, the more we do, the less the government in Baghdad, the government in Ankara, the government in Riyadh, the government in Amman, etc., are going to do. And particularly if all of these states think that the United States is going to defend them no matter what, to the extent that they have to think about some internal reforms dealing with this problem, they are allowed essentially to free ride a bit more on us. So I think the United States has a role to play here, but it ought to be very very much in the background. This is primarily a problem for the locals who have much more at stake than we do to deal with. One final point is I think we've already seen some amount of resonance in other countries. Just by inspiration, ISIS gets some set of people to go off and do an act of terrorism, not because they're getting orders from the Islamic State, but because they're inspired by the example. That's happened in a number of places. It's going to happen it's going to continue to happen for some time. This is unfortunate, but it's not existential. The number of people that have actually been killed by ISIS-related attacks over the last 2 years is, 500 or 600 worldwide, outside of ISIS land itself, and that's unfortunate. But again, in that same period, 25,000 Americans were murdered. So we ought to keep that number in some perspective and not overreact whenever something like this does happen. Right,
I agree. But if there's one thing I think we can count on, it's that people will overreact, both here and in Europe. And that's why, when I think of kind of the threat that ISIS poses, I don't think of it so much I don't analyze it so much in terms of, ISIS as state and how does it compare with past states and other states. The thing I worry about is its presence and seeming vibrance, inspiring homegrown terrorism, people in Europe and the United States overreacting to that, saying we need to get more visibly involved in an actual military conflict with ISIS, or we need to more closely monitor what's going on in our mosques, or stop more people at the airport named Mohammed, or whatever, do the various things that only make homegrown terrorism more likely and the message of ISIS more appealing. So that's I agree with you. We shouldn't overreact, but it just seems the overreaction is so likely that we really do have a problem here.
Well, I think that's a problem of our own making. Right. And, what people like me and you try to do is try to persuade our fellow citizens to learn from past experience and be smarter going forward. So we were attacked on September 11th, and we responded in some smart ways, but we also responded in a number of really stupid ways. We took the bait that Osama bin Laden dangled out there. He desperately was hoping we would do something stupid like invade Iraq, and we foolishly obliged him. Well, 14 years have gone by. We've seen that movie. If we haven't learned from that experience, that's our fault. That's not the evil cleverness of our adversaries. That's our own folly. And, one of the things we ought to be trying to do is be smarter about it. Now, Boston suffered a terrorist attack a couple of years ago with the marathon bombings. And it was, in some sense, these guys weren't taking orders from Al-Qaeda Central or from the Islamic State or anybody else. They were just a couple of knuckleheads who got infused with a set of ideas and did a horrific thing. But the Boston response, nicely epitomized by, David Ortiz of the Red Sox, don't expletive deleted our city, was exactly right. Essentially, we're resilient, we're tough. We understand that bad things happen, but we're not going to go off and do a bunch of stupid things. We're not going to invade Chechnya because the Tsarnaev brother had gone to Chechnya. That's exactly the kind of response we ought to be expecting of ourselves now. And we ought to be insisting that our political leaders start speaking in those terms as opposed to what they normally do, which is to talk about how danger is enormous, how we have to spend more on X, Y, or Z in precisely the manner you were just saying. You may be right. We may be incapable of that kind of strategic foresight, especially in an era when, cable news channels love it when anything, however minor, happens, that they can then broadcast 24/7 and show us tapes and get talking heads to come on and talk about how much danger we're all in. So it may be very difficult, but it's our responsibility to try and prevent that from happening.
Yeah. Now, as far as what is the U.S. policy toward ISIS now, it doesn't seem to me tremendously coherent. And let me just give you a couple of examples. I mean, We are supporting a Saudi military campaign in Yemen that consists largely of degrading the forces that fight against ISIS. In Turkey, we've cut a deal where Turkey's going to let us use military bases in Turkey from which we can better fight ISIS. And the official story is and Turkey is going to join in the fight against ISIS. But it looks like what's actually happening is, in exchange, we are countenancing a very ramped up war by the Kurdish government against Kurds that they find threatening. And these Kurds they're fighting are closely affiliated with some Kurds who have been one of the most effective fighting forces against ISIS. And then there's, of course, the further paradox that we say, well, we're gonna fight against ISIS, while fighting and degrading the Assad regime. That's at least our story. Whereas the Assad regime is one of ISIS's biggest enemies. I mean, it doesn't seem to make any sense to me at all.
Yeah. I think that's right. And there's, I think, 2 points to make about this. One is, among other things, the story you just told tells you something, which is that the local actors, the Turks, the Saudis, the Kurds, the Iranians to some degree, the Shia in Baghdad, they don't like the Islamic State, but they're not necessarily placing it as the most dangerous threat that they face. If they thought they were dealing with the reincarnation of Nazi Germany, right, then you'd suddenly find the Turks, the Jordanians, the Saudis, and everybody cooperating to get rid of them, right? But in fact, if you're the Turks, well, you don't like the Islamic State, that's trouble, but the Kurds are probably more trouble, or at least you worry more about Kurdish aspirations for independence. The Saudis don't like the Islamic State, they see it as a problem, but they really don't like the Assad regime either, and they would like them both to go down, but that's hard to arrange because, of course, as you said, the Assad regime and ISIS are opposed. And that's kind of true of us as well, right? We haven't been able to decide which of these things is our top priority. I think that tells you that the Islamic State's a problem, but it is not the kind of existential threat you sometimes hear about when people get really, hyper ventilated about it. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is we ought to remind ourselves that this is not an existential threat to vital American interests. All of these other actors have more skin in the game than we do. We, in fact, although we're accustomed to thinking of the entire world as a vital interest, we've gotten into that habit. The United States is, in fact, a long way away from that part of the world. It's rather difficult to attack the United States from that part of the world in any, strategically significant way. We can afford, therefore, to take a somewhat more measured view. We can afford to pass the buck, if you will, to actors in the region. We may want to help them in various ways, but they should be taking the lead, and we should be insisting that this is primarily their problem to solve. And the other reason we should be doing that is that I think the last 20 years have proven that we're not very good at social engineering in that part of the world. The more actively involved we get in different parts of the Middle East, the worse things tend to get. Things are worse now in Libya than they were under Gaddafi, in partly because of our involvement. Things are worse in Yemen now than they were 20 years ago, in part, not entirely, but in part because of our involvement there. Things are certainly much worse in Iraq. They were already bad under Saddam, but they're much worse today. So almost every part of the Middle East that we've touched in a big and visible way in the last 20 years is in worse condition now than it used to be. And we might want to learn a lesson from that, too, that maybe trying to manipulate the politics of that region is something that we're just not very good at. Yeah. And so I should add one other thing, and certainly not very good at with our preferred tool, which tends to be the American military and is a pretty crude instrument despite its many impressive capabilities.
Yeah. On the point you made about how ISIS doesn't pose much of a threat to the U.S., I'd go in a way further and say if it does pose a threat, to the extent that it poses a threat, it is mainly by inspiring people already in America to commit acts of terrorism. And if you ask what empowers it to do that, a few things empower it more than a very prominent, conspicuous American war against ISIS. Now, I'm not saying that's the end of the consideration, because there are other reasons it might make sense to fight against ISIS, but I'm just struck by how in the whole debate over this, you almost never hear anyone, when Obama decided to not just bomb kind of tactically when he initially did against ISIS, but kind of rhetorically he decided to turn it into a virtual declaration of war against ISIS. I didn't hear anyone in the entire foreign policy establishment, journalists, think tank, anyone say, wait a second, isn't it the case that the only actual threat they pose is inspiring homegrown terrorism, and won't this possibly exacerbate that? It just doesn't seem to be in the conversation.
Now you're sounding like a blame America first kind of person.
Oh, it's not the first time I've been accused of that. But I'm not quite. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I think that's why you don't hear that point being raised very loudly. And exactly as you say, it's not that concern is a trump card that ends discussion. You can't just sort of say, well, what if we inspire homegrown terrorism? Maybe we shouldn't do anything. Maybe you decide on net that vigorous action is necessary, even if one cost of it is some heightened level of homegrown terrorism. On balance, we'll be better off. But one at least has to ask that particular question of whether or not we're ultimately going to make Americans safer, which is sort of the first responsibility here, by getting actively involved, leading campaign to degrade and destroy ISIS, or whether or not we are better off letting locals deal with it primarily while our role remains very much in the background. That may be, sort of more likely to succeed in the long run in that part of the world, and less likely to provoke the kind of sympathetic responses among a very tiny fraction of people who are already here in the United States.
And finally, on the point you made about how actually many of the so-called enemies of ISIS, like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, are ambivalent, have other priorities that compete with confronting ISIS and so on, this kind of brings us back to the beginning of the conversation, because the irony is that if there is one power in the region that is not very ambivalent in its opposition to ISIS, it's Iran. And now a big part of, Congress and the foreign policy establishment in the U.S., at least a non-trivial part of the foreign policy establishment and a big part of Congress, is working as hard as possible to do something that would impede the kind of relationship between Iran and the U.S. that might facilitate coordination in opposition to ISIS.
Right. And I think that, again, the lack of strategic consistency partly reflects the complexity of the set of relations there, but it also reflects 30 plus years of demonizing the Islamic Republic of Iran and treating it as a sort of almost a cartoon boogeyman, responsible for all the worst things in the world. We had to come up with a replacement for the former Soviet Union, and this is, Saddam was there for a while, and now this is the best we can do. The other thing about it, even if you were a sort of real Iranophobe, right, getting your adversary enmeshed in difficult, challenging, vexing, possibly open-ended conflicts is not necessarily such a horrible thing from a strategic point of view. So if you were a real Iranophobe, what's the bad thing about having Iran do most of the work in dealing with the Islamic State? We don't like the Islamic State very much. Wouldn't it be better to let them take on the burdens of dealing with it rather than insisting on having the burdens ourselves? And if it means they get bogged down dealing with them, or they face some of the problems, that's better than facing them ourselves. And this is a way of thinking about our involvement in the world that is almost completely gone now, because we're so addicted to the idea that, we're the world's hegemon. We are the country that should be exercising leadership everywhere. And other countries around the world, I think, take advantage of this constantly. You can always get the Americans to go off and do something foolish by questioning their credibility or by saying how much you want them there. And we ought to be thinking about our interests first and foremost. Spoken like an old-fashioned realist, which I think you would say you in some ways are. You're certainly a realist. I don't know if you consider yourself old-fashioned. Let me put it another way. Spoken like a classic realist. Thank you. That I'll accept. Okay. Well, thank you for taking the time. I'm not sure I found this conversation encouraging, but I did find it illuminating. So thanks a lot.